the appointed time, and we have already formed a quorum. I'd like to remind members that if members have any direct or indirect pecuniary interest with the items under discussion today, then in accordance with Rule 83A of the Rules of Procedure, before you speak on the subject matter, please disclose the nature of such interest. And I'd also like to draw members' attention to Rule 84 of the Rules of Procedure with regard to the rules governing voting where there is a direct pecuniary interest. First item, PC FCR 2013-14-25. This item invites members to approve 9 proposals discussed at 2 meetings held on the 5th and the 11th of June 2013 of the PWSC meeting. So they are PWSC 7, 8, 13 to 16, 18, 19, and 22. And no member has asked that any of these items be singled out for separate voting. And if members have no further questions, then I'll put the item to the vote. Will those in favor of FCR 2013-14-25 please raise their hands? Those against, please raise their hands. I think all the members participating in the vote are in favor. Item 2, FCR 2013-14-26, Head 186 Transport Department. Members are asked to approve a new commitment of $190.359 million for the continued provision of special helping measures for the 6 major outlying island ferry routes. On the 24th of May, the THB consulted the transport panel on its views on this item. With us today we have Professor Anthony Cheung, Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Joseph Lai, Permanent Secretary for Transport and Housing, and Mr. Andy Chan, Deputy Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Josiah Tao, Principal Assistant Secretary for the Bureau, and Mrs. Ingrid Young, Commissioner for Transport, and Mr. Albert Su, Assistant Commissioner for Transport. The administration would like us to allow the Secretary for Transport and Housing to make a short statement. Yes, we're asking for about $190 million for the continued provision of special helping measures for the 6 major outlying island ferry routes for the next licensing period, that is mid-2014 to mid-2017. In order to maintain the financial viability of ferry services, and that will be done on an accountable basis and reimbursement basis, in order to ensure that the operators will attach importance to operational efficiency, and we believe that these operators should be working on commercial principles, and therefore, generally speaking, there should be no subsidy whatsoever. But then we believe that given the circumstances, there should be special helping measures. There are 2 reasons. Number 1, basically that's the only mode of transport for those living on the outlying islands, and basically for a very long term there has been no growth in the population living in the outlying islands, Cheung Chau, Ping Chau, and Lamma Island, because in 2011, the overall population actually dropped from some 43,000 to about 40,000 during the period, and that's why the demand for ferry services has remained stagnant. And given the fact that the operating cost has been going up, and unless they increase fare substantially, there will be loss making, and therefore, in order to avoid this from happening, with regard to the 6 major ferry routes serving the outlying islands, the administration is offering this limited special helping measures. On the one hand, we'd like to make sure that they'll be able to operate basically on commercial principles, and on the other hand, we would also like to ease the pressure on fare in order to alleviate the burden on the passengers. And under this policy, other than fuel and also staff emolument and also depreciation costs for the other expenditure items, they could also be covered by the measures, and all the details are in para 11 and also in enclosure 2. For the two ferry operators, they have already indicated that they would also like to extend their license for another 3 years. But then the pretext is that the existing SHP will have to be maintained, and there should also be appropriate upward adjustment with regard to whether or not their licenses would be renewed. There will have to be further negotiation. But then if there is any fare increase application, the administration will be acting as a gatekeeper to ensure that we will be taking care of the passengers' affordability. We would not allow them to just increase fares arbitrarily, and if they do not wish to ask for a renew, then we will have to tender out the whole process. And on the 24th and 28th of May this year, we consulted the transport panel of this council and also the TAC respectively, and members generally supported the proposal. We also understand that some members of this council would also like the administration to look into other long-term measures in order to resolve this problem that for a long while, the ferry services have not been financially viable. In fact, as we have stated, for the administration to procure vessels and then outsource the operation, whether or not it's feasible, we've also looked into this. But then other than the procurement cost, in 2010, the cost would be about $1.7 billion, and the administration would also have to be responsible for the management and also the maintenance costs for the vessels. And on top of that, we will also have to offer special helping measures to the operators. And other than in order to increase the non-fare box receipt or revenues for the 6 major ferry routes, actually we are also planning the construction of additional floors at Central Piers numbers 4, 5, and 6 in order to ensure that after 2017 there will be long-term financial subsidy. We have already heard members' views expressed at the meeting held on June 11th with regard to the PWSC item on the additional floors to be built at Piers 4, 5, and 6. They also talk about how we can improve the management and also design of the piers. We will be following up on those concerns very positively, and later on we will be submitting papers to the PWSC in order to seek their support. And therefore, this item is not covered by today's paper. I also hope that the Finance Committee will approve the funding proposal in this paper, and then afterwards the Transport Department will start the formal negotiations with the operators on the renewal of license, and my colleagues and I will be happy to take members' questions. All right, Mr. Chen Kam-lam, Transport Panel Chair, please report on the deliberation of the panel. Chairman, on the 24th of May, the Transport Panel discussed the 6 major ferry services to the outlying islands requiring the special helping measures. In principle, members supported the funding proposal, but then some members asked that the administration should offer fuel expenditure subsidy to the operators in order to replace the maintenance costs for the vessels. That would facilitate members of the public in monitoring such subsidy. And some members also urged the administration to procure vessels in order to outsource the operation to contractors. And the members also asked the administration to provide information with regard to the 6 major outlying island ferry services with regard to concessionary fare for children from mid-2011 to mid-2012, and the information has been forwarded to members for their information. Thank you. 7 members have pressed the button. Any other members who would like to speak? Because we have 4 items today. 8 members have indicated that they'd like to speak. All right. 4 minutes each. First, Mr. Tan Ka-Piu. Thank you, Chairman. I'm also a member of the Islands District Council. With regard to the use of public funds or special helping measures to help the outlying island residents because they have no alternative but to take the ferries, well, we support this policy. But then in the past, the IDC has already said that we should use this amount to subsidize the fuel costs, because that would enable the public to monitor it more effectively. Or we can also procure the vessels and then we can also rent them to the operators, because the operators are claiming that they're making a loss, and if we do not allow them to have this subsidy, they'll have to increase fares. But then how many ferry operators are there? We all know that there might just be a handful of them who are able to run such services, and therefore the proposal that we should procure the vessels ourselves is to make sure that we don't want to see a situation whereby there is no replacement operator available, and now they're getting the money for another 3 years. It's a black hole, because for maintenance costs it would account for some $90 million, and so we will have to support it. We have no alternative. But then with regard to how the money should be used, is there a better way to use it? We do have some doubts about this, and I haven't heard the undertaking by the Secretary. Alright, the money will be spent, but then what about the fare for the next 3 years? Does it mean that there will be no pressure on the fares in the next 3 years? I have not heard any guarantee or undertaking. So if you are not able to give this undertaking, then how are you able to ensure that they would not be asking for a fare hike, and what factors will be taken into account? And also, as a district councillor, I would also like to file this complaint, because when you submitted the paper to the district council, it was only a 3-page paper, and there was no breakdown whatsoever, and there was no cost effectiveness report. But then when you come to this council, you're offering, or you're providing this 11-page document. But then why is it that you only provided a 3-page document to the DC? I think you should show adequate respect for district councillors. Well, on the last point, on the consultation with the Island District Council, I'll defer to the Commissioner later. With regard to the cash subsidy, well, our policy is that on the one hand, we'd like to respect the fact that, well, for private operators, they would be operating the services on prudent commercial principles. But then on the other hand, we also have to take care of outlying island passengers, because they are relying on the ferry services as their main mode of transport, and they have no alternative. That's the policy. And also, on the other hand, we would also like to make sure that as far as the fare is concerned, it should be affordable, and therefore we are trying to strike a balance, and as a result, we have now offered this subsidy with regard to all items to be covered by the SHMs. Then for the private operator, basically there is no risk, and it would be a risk-free operation, and that would be against the first principle that I set out. With regard to whether or not we can ensure that there will be no fare increase, we're just trying to maintain the stability of the fare, and also for the user, they would also be taking up the responsibility and burden appropriately. That's why under our policy, if the operator wants to apply for a fare hike, then we will have to look at it comprehensively. We will have to look at the operating conditions, and also in terms of cost saving, what have they done, and also the revenue and so on. We'll be looking at everything. Yes, Commissioner? Well, in April, we went to the Island District Council to brief them on the interim review on the SHMs, and at the time, we also promised the IDC that once we finalize the future policy on whether or not we're going to continue with the SHMs, so we'll be going back to report to them, and therefore we'll be going back to the IDC to report to them on the ferry services and also the future direction. Dr. Helena Wong. Thank you, Chairman. The way we go about it, all right, we are in a dilemma. Well, we have no choice but to support you, but then does it mean that for loss-making ferry routes, nobody would be running them? And in para 19 of the paper, and also enclosure 4, actually you've taken some measures. You said that the government has been providing various helping services to reduce the operating costs. How come you're still asking for $190 million? Because the ferry services have been there for so many years, and you always know that without government's assistance, they will not be able to make it. So why have you not reviewed the efficiency or effectiveness of their operations? All right, in enclosures 4 and 5, you've been doing that all along, and still you're asking for $190 million. Has it already covered everything in the 4 parts of the enclosure, or does it not cover it? And the second question is, well, ultimately, we hope that the piers will be able to have more non-fare box revenue so that they can run other services. You said that 1.5 additional floors will have to be built so that they can lease some of the shop premises, so that they can run other business, so that there will be some non-fare box revenue to subsidize the ferry services. How come you have not been able to do it yet? Is it that the measures are not effective, or is it something? Has it got anything to do with your plan or design? Because we hope that they'll be able to run a self-sufficient service by operating some non-fare box operations. Secretary, in enclosure 4A, actually that covers all ferry services, not just the outlying island ferry services. And for the amount mentioned in this paper, that is the $190 million that we are applying for, and that has been set out in para 11. And this is a breakdown of that when compared to what we did back in 2010-11, when the FC approved the SHM for 2011 to 2014. Actually is about the same, and at the time the FC approved $114.96 million. But then in view of the fact that the interim review was conducted,
we think there is room to adjust the cap upwards. And so starting from 2014 and to 2017, for the next 3-year license period, we propose to raise the cap up to $190 million. And about non-fare box revenue, we hope through that the major outlying ferry services do not have to rely on the means for revenue at present. That's why we propose to expand central piers 4, 5, and 6. And of course, that will be discussed at PWSC later. Follow-up. After 3 years, we will see the completion of the piers construction. And do you have to come back again 3 years later for $190 million? That will depend on whether we get the support of PWSC, and we will also conduct our own assessment concerning the amount. Mr. Lee Cheuk-yen, the Labour Party will not oppose the subsidy measures, but is not exactly or fully effective. On the one hand, you say this is some subsidy for the operators, but then they can make fair rise applications. And how can the administration do a good gatekeeping job? The public does not have much confidence in that regard. With the subsidies, in fact, the operators should not be applying for fare hike. And now, on holidays, the fare is especially high. And as a result, the shop operators on the islands will be affected. These are structural problems. How come you are not trying to resolve them altogether in one go? And how come even after the special measures are in place, there will still be application for fare rise? Now, the island residents do not have any choice, so there should be a kind of purchase of service. So, and it means the fare should be pocketed by the government, just like the case as in Cross Harbour Tunnel. So in a way, the government is buying the service. And how come you are saying that for this kind of public transport, public services, it should be operated by the private sector? On the one hand, you say that, and on the other hand, you are subsidizing these operators. You are saying that. That's why I ask you, how come you are not procuring these services? And you allow operators on the superstructure of the piers in the future. How come you are not doing that so then you can get the rent from the operators? And the money can then be plowed back to the service provision, and the government can then control the fares instead of the operators. Secretary, whether the services are to be operated by the government directly or that should be operated by way of procurement of service, or whether the services should be provided by the private sector, we have to face cost effectiveness. And if there is a fall in demand, what we have to do when we face a deficit. We put forward this proposal after balancing these factors. By providing subsidy, it doesn't mean that the operators do not have to take up any risk, because otherwise people will say that the government should subsidize all the transport services on the whole. As for the long run, can the government procure vessels and outsource the service? From our review in 2010, we found that was not feasible. Even if we procure the vessels, we have to face the long-term deficit or long-term loss. That's why we think providing reimbursement at actual cost is cost-effective. We will not rule out whether we can come up with other ways to boost cost-effectiveness. What about fare rise? After setting the helping measures, we're providing help to the operators as to whether the operators will need to raise fare. They will have to give reasons and justifications for that. We also scrutinize the reasons they put forward. We, for example, see whether they have done enough in terms of cost effectiveness. So it's not like they can do whatever they like. Now, 12 members are waiting to speak, and we only have one session for this meeting. So please be succinct in terms of raising questions and giving replies, all right? Mr. Leung Chi-chung. Thank you, Chairman. I opened 2 offices on the outlying islands, so I travel quite frequently between the islands. I found that they raised the fare. Single trip to Pingchao, $50 odd, $50 odd. And so for return trips, I have to spend over $100. I have to travel from Tin Shui Wai to Central first. So you can imagine how much I have to pay for fare. I don't understand why the government is subsidizing the operators. In fact, they charge more on weekends. Now, the Secretary said that he hopes with the measures, the fare can be lowered, or there will not be a fall in passengers. But then they may be allowed to raise the fare. That will not boost the passenger number. So the government is actually sandwiched between the public and the ferry operators. And so you have no choice but to give this $190 odd. And you have no choice but try to make more money by allowing shop operators on the superstructure of the piers. Now, if you go to Tai O and Mui Wo, that people have other choices in going there. But for Lemma and Pingchao, people have no choice but opt for the ferry. So are there any means to minimize the possibilities of raising fares? At present, we target people who mainly rely on ferries. So if residents can opt for other mode of transport, they are not our targets. You are right in saying that the fare for weekends is about 40% higher than weekdays. Now, our consideration is with the island residents who have no choice but rely on the ferry service. So our target is not the tourist. And, well, I don't understand why there is this program of outlying island tourism. And you haven't answered why they have to charge higher. The operators have to charge higher for holidays and weekends. Subsidy for elderly concession and child concession are some special measures provided by the operators, but the measures we provide are off target are the residents on the islands, not the tourists. Well, why don't you directly subsidize the island residents? That may be better. If that's the case, with our current proposal, we can stabilize the fares, and we think the fare is affordable at present. And for frequent users, they can get monthly tickets so they can enjoy more concession. Mr. Chen Hengpan. It's true that there is a fall in island population, but does it mean there are fewer people taking the ferries? I don't think so, because the tourism industry in the islands are well developed. People in Changchou would like to see public housing be built there, but the government has not done that. So the residents can no longer live on the islands. Now, some members asked the government to give subsidies on fuel and to procure vessels. And this measure will last for 3 years. Do you want the operators to invest more or not? The operator may not think it's feasible to buy a new vessel if the license will expire after 3 years. So I think the administration should have comprehensive policy concerning the review of ferry services. When will that take place? Now, the renewal of license is coming up, and the license will last for another 3 years. Does it mean we have to wait for years before we see any improvement? Can the administration expedite improvement of ferry services? And some people say that the over $100 million are for island residents only. But, well, in fact, funding for road repair and for installation of lights, there are kind of subsidies too. I hope people will not be so harsh to island residents. About population, the population growth on islands is slow, and on holidays, more people go to the outlying islands. I agree with Mr. Chen that in terms of housing development on islands, if we speed up, the population there may be increased. and we may see some changes in ferry services. For the 3-year license period, the license can be renewed of up to as many as 10 years. Now, in fact, there have been discussions to see whether the license period can be extended so that the operators will look at the operating environment differently. Is there any time frame? We've been talking about this for years.
But then do you have a timetable as to when you will start the review? Well, Chairman, we hope that what we are proposing is that there should be another 3-year license period, and during the 3-year period, we'll be comprehensively looking at the ferry policy for outlying islands, and then for the non-fare box revenue, we will also have to look at the sources of such revenue, including the redevelopment of the 3 piers in Central. But then we would like to have a more sustainable and long-term policy so that there can be a better revenue basis for these ferry services. But then, of course, if offering a longer-term license will help, we will consider that. Ms. Emily Lau. Well, Chairman, according to the Secretary, yes, the population in the outlying islands might fall. Well, it's not surprising because the fares are so expensive. Well, you've been building roads in different locations. Well, they look really nice, but then no wonder they think that they have so much subsidy. But then by living in the outlying islands, there is no choice, and the fares are so expensive. But then if you live in Hong Kong, Whampoa Garden, then actually some of the services have been scrapped. In fact, with ferry services, that could also ease traffic congestion, and also if they can use renewable fuel, that would also be good. Well, we are not like Venice, but then we do have a lot of many facilities available. But then you've been relocating them to such remote locations. No wonder people do not like to patronize the service. And you're saying that only where population has grown to a certain extent will you be increasing the services. So many people are saying that that's been said for many years, and the administration should be looking at your ferry policy more comprehensively. And if you're going to scrap the service for the Whampoa Garden, then they're actually asking you to offer a subsidy of just $1 million, and yet you're not willing to do that. All right, when it comes to ferry services, well, whatever political party we belong to, we all want to ensure that passengers in the outlying islands, whether they are visitors or residents, they should be paying reasonable fares. Para 10, you talk about the construction of additional floors at the piers. All right, a couple of weeks ago at the PWSC meeting, we rejected your proposal. It's not that we are not in favor, it's that we have a lot of concerns. But then apparently you say that because of the short licensing period of 3 years, after it's been rejected, you have not been able to catch up. But then you've given us so little lead time. Apparently, you just take it for granted that the item will be approved in one go, and now you've not managed to do it, and apparently you're telling us to wait for another 3 years. So how can that be the case, Secretary? Yes, I do understand that at the PWC meeting, members expressed some concerns. We'll be taking that up very proactively. We understand that you have a point there because for the rents, you will have to make sure that you can get the best rent, and also the operating mode will have to be most efficient. And therefore, after the summer break, we'll be coming back to the PWSC meeting. And according to our current assessment, if we are able to provide something that is acceptable to members, we hope that they will support us, and we think that we will still be able to make it. But then, as members have said, it might be time for us to comprehensively review the situation, and also in our waters, should we be making more use of ferry services to replace other modes of transport. But then what has to be borne in mind is that for whatever mode of transport, it has to be sustainable. In other words, we cannot just rely on subsidy for the operations. Chairman, I think the Secretary will also have to think about it. Well, please do not compare that with those living in the outlying islands. For people living in the new territories like yourself, so do they enjoy similar road or land-based facilities? So is it fair to make that comparison? Is it fair to say that, all right, for ferry services, we are subsidizing you so heavily, but what about bridges, flight and expressways and so on? For those living in the remote districts, is it fair too? Well, for the 6 major ferry services to the outlying islands for the pier maintenance and so on, we have already been offering this subsidy. I think you have switched off my microphone. That's why you have not been able to hear me. Well, for railway investment and also road development, and of course we do know that the amount invested into those facilities would be even higher. But then the member is suggesting that when compared to land-based transport, ferry services might not have had adequate government investment. I do understand that point. Yes, Mr. Wong Kwok Heng. Thank you, Chairman. Well, on this funding proposal, I'll be prepared to support it because there is no alternative. Without this funding, outlying island residents will be seriously affected. But then, even with the funding approval, it's not going to solve the problem. I'm sure for members who have spoken, they all share this sentiment. The problem is the administration has not been dealing with outlying island residents' traffic needs properly. Concerning resources for ferry services, there is a lack of a comprehensive and long-term policy on the part of the government. In fact, during the last term of government, as a member from the NT West and also as an FC member in the previous term, I already criticized the administration for being discriminatory against outlying island residents. I used that wording back in the past. In fact, I still maintain this stance even now, because I can see that for outlying island residents, for the burden on them for traffic and transport has been very heavy. And in fact, you have always adopted a symptomatic approach. And during the last term of government, you have not resolved this problem. And now is this term of government, and the incumbent bureau director has to face up to this problem. I hope that you can review the situation concerning the support for outlying island residents, and also you should review your ferry policy. You should not discriminate against them. Well, for example, for railway development, how come it can develop so rapidly and so remarkably? That's because of government policy. Because the administration has invested heavily in the development of our railway system. That's why railway development has advanced in leaps and bounds. But then for ferry services, there have been no developments. In fact, they have been shrinking. They have been going back. So as the Bureau for Transport and Housing, with transport there must be housing. How come on the outlying islands there are so many lots and so many buildings, and yet there have not been any significant development? That's because of the heavy traveling expenses that are involved. So you will have to look at it more comprehensively. Let me cite an example. Taking the piers 4, 5, 6 and the superstructure development. Actually, recently, you came to the PWSC and you actually did not manage to have the item approved. In fact, in the previous term of government, that was already raised, but then the matter has dragged on. And now in Enclosure 4, the administration's response is that you will be planning that more positively. But then, for the ferry operators, if they only have a 3-year licensing period, then how can you expect them to plan for longer-term developments which are sound in the operations? And therefore, I hope that you can consider offering a 5 or 6 year licensing period instead of 3 years. It would be more appropriate for a longer term to be offered. I believe that that is something that the administration must consider. And you also have to look at the superstructure development at the pier. You will have to make the best use of those additional floor space in order to ensure that the operation is viable. In fact, for the superstructure development at the pier, it's not just about the central piers. In fact, for the outlying island piers, they should also be fully considered. So these are my comments, and I do not need a response. Yes, Dr. Kwok. Chairman, I think this funding proposal is hard to disapprove, because without the $190 million, then outlying island residents will be facing tremendous problems, including the pressure on fares. I'd like to ask two questions of principles about the cross-subsidy. Well, for NT Northeast, actually you spent some $120 billion in order to subsidize the infrastructure and railway development. But then for ferry services, you're calling it cash subsidy. But then for the others, you're not calling it a subsidy at all. I think you're actually stealthily substituting the concepts. So can you also think about the development of transport infrastructure in the outlying islands? So can you tell us exactly how much you've spent on that? In fact, if you look at the individual district, in particular the new the NDAs, actually you're talking about tens of billions of dollars. And then on the incident at Lemma Island, well, Hong Kong Kowloon ferry Hong Kong the HKK is involved, and therefore how are you able to ensure that the operators will be enhancing their performances? All right, you're offering them this subsidy on repair and maintenance. For example, if I have some vessels, I'd like to run a better service, but then the administration is giving me money to repair and maintain the vessels, and that's why if I can do it at my own dockyard, I don't mind it, because you are actually covering that expense. But then it's not going to work, Secretary. You will have to think out several items, and you think that it's going to work? No, that will not work, because in the long run, well, for railway services, yes, the MTRCL, well, is held by the administration. Actually, you hold some 17% of the shares, or 77% of the shares. So how come the administration cannot just ask a quasi-government body to run the services here? Well, in terms of environmental protection, they will use new ferries or new vessels, so that in terms of the safety margin, and you can also upgrade the standard of the captains and so on. And also, different members have also said that for the holiday fare, well, this is something that you will absolutely have to deal with. All right, Bureau Director, you want more people to visit the islands, but then if it costs some $50–60 per trip, then as for the lower income families, they simply cannot afford it. So you're trying to encourage more people to use these facilities and more people to live there. Actually, is running counter to your objectives. So how are you able to ensure that the grassroots will be able to afford to live in those islands? So this is also one of the reasons why you cannot have a long-term development there. Well, for outlying islands, yes, of course, there is potential for further development, but then we cannot just give instructions to people and mandate that they should live there. And in terms of infrastructure and how we are able to ensure that for different districts they can be connected very efficiently, well, both sea transport and land transport, we adopt the same approach. But then for sea transport, there are other planning constraints, for example, greening, and also some parameters or indicators for planning. We will have to meet those parameters too. With regard to cross-subsidy, well, for public transport operations, we have no subsidy whatsoever. And of course, Dr. Kwok and other members have said that for investment on land-based facilities, should that be treated as a subsidy? That's debatable, because sometimes when the infrastructure is there, well, for the community development and also the land value and so on, that might be helpful. So we may not be looking at it from the perspective of a subsidy, but then for the special helping measures that we are proposing, that's to help the outlying island residents, because they have no alternative but to use ferries. And also in terms of the operation, whether it's operated directly by the administration or by a contractor or operator, they will still have to ensure that there will be cost effectiveness, so that they can minimize loss, and therefore it's very similar. But then you have not answered the question. That is for the long-term repair and maintenance cost. Dr. Kwok, your time is up. Mr. Tam Yu Chong. Well, Chairman, after you have heard so many members speak, actually, Bureau Director, you should know that they all support the subsidy for the ferry services. That should be done because there is a uniqueness in the service, and it should not be compared to other land-based transport. Because if you look at the ferry services, the overall cost is high. Well, for a franchise bus, it only has to be operated by one driver. But then for a ferry, you will need to have a crew, and also for fuel costs is also very high, and repair and maintenance costs are also rather hefty. Therefore, if you offer some subsidy so that outlying island residents do not have to take up this very heavy burden in the form of fare, I think it's reasonable. You should not be very rigid. You should not say that for all public transports, for all public transport services, the administration should not subsidize them. Well, earlier on, the DAB already said that the administration should consider procuring the vessels, and then you should outsource the service to service providers. So that should be the way to run the service. But then the administration said that it's not viable, it's not cost effective. By that, I think you are saying that the administration might be incurring more expenditure.
But these special helping measures are just something temporary. And later, people may have to face quite substantial rise in fare. Now, some routes have fewer passengers and some more. So you have to shuffle the resources for these two kinds of routes. Island residents have some views on that. Recently, there's the $2 fare concession scheme for elderly people. I'm sure that benefit the ferry operators. But at peak hours, the elderly people and those people who have to take the ferry to work have to scramble for services, and those who have to work may not be able to board the ferries. I think the administration should see what it can do to the situation. Because at present, at morning, the ferries are packed, and it seems that the operators are not proposing increasing the frequency of ferry services. Thank you, Mr. Tam, for the question. Our basic principle is that the government will not subsidize the operators of public transport. But for the 6 major outlying island ferry routes, is a kind of special helping measures covering staff cost, fuel cost, and some relevant factors, etc. That's because island residents have to rely on ferry services, and we don't want their mobility of moving to transporting to the urban area to be limited. We understand that after the concession scheme have been launched, more elderly people are making use of the ferry services, and that some students and people who are working encounter some problems. We'll liaise with operators to see how we can better improve the situation. Mr. Alice Mack. Now, of course, we'll support the funding allocation, but how can the administration ensure that the ferry operators will not say to you that because of operating difficulties they have to ask for a fare rise? Will you think about extending the license period or subsidizing fuel cost? Mr. Tam just now asked about frequency of services, and I want to talk about covers. For example, at present, the program or the scheme covers only accidents on land, on road. Are there any ways that you can extend the protection to sea accidents? Well, I understand that the LegCo already had some discussions about whether we can have a scheme to offer protection to people injured at sea accidents. We're discussing that. As for whether the license period can be longer than 3 years, we are open-minded to that. We'll proactively consider that. If that will be of any help to operators so that they will make further considerations about long-term service, we'll consider that. Any follow-up, Ms. Mack? Mr. Lang Yuchong. Thank you, Chairman. Just now, the Secretary said that for purchasing vessels and outsourcing services, this is not very cost-effective. What about the cost-effectiveness of this special helping measures, SHM? Because for me, I think the cost-effectiveness of the SHM is even worse than purchasing your own vessels and outsourcing services. The subsidy here is just better than nothing. Why? Because at the end of the day, the operators can apply for fair rights. So there is still burden, pressure on passengers. Because there is bound to be a fair rise. The fare is already very high already, and even with the measures, you're not addressing the pressure of fare rise. Secondly, I think on the face of it, it seems that it's right to say we should not subsidize tourists. But in essence, no. Because on holidays, not all the passengers are tourists. Many passengers board the ferry so they can reunite with their families. But because of the high fare, many people do not go back to the islands to reunite with their family members. And so the elderly people on the island will have to travel away to the other areas. And with this situation, the number of passengers using ferries is not going to increase. How come there's a fall in population on the islands? That's because the fare is more and more expensive. So they rather move to the urban area and bear with the high rent instead of the high fares. So in terms of cost effectiveness, I wouldn't say the SHM has zero cost effectiveness, but I think it is low. We're just talking here. So, Secretary, have you calculated to see whether the SHM is more cost-effective than buying your own vessels? As I said at the beginning, even if we purchase the vessels, we have to look at the cost for maintenance and repair. And we also have to look at the demand and the population on the islands. Even if operators rent vessels from the government, we expect them to be that they will need our subsidies. And buying our own fleet will need $1.7 billion. That's why I say purchasing our own vessels will be less cost effective. But it doesn't mean that we will rule that out. Chairman, can I ask for a written report because it's too abstract. When we conduct it in a discussion, I think the secretary likes conducting studies. So why don't we ask him to have a written report for us? Chairman, I can't complete that within a short time. Many members have asked whether it's possible for the administration to buy its own vessels, whether it is more cost-effective. It was raised at the panel discussion, and at that time I said we would consider that. But in 2012, we reviewed it, and we have doubts about the effectiveness of that proposal. I have to stop you because you have run out of 4 minutes. Mr. Michael Tan. Last time, the subsidy stood at $114 million, and the revenue, profit margin of the operators was below 5%. Now, if they enjoy 10% of profit margin, will a certain amount be taken out of the $190 million? Now, we're subsidizing private operators with public money. If the operators are not making money, you give them subsidies. But if they are earning a lot, how come we have to subsidize them? Are you using return on fair at 5%? Secretary. Chairman, concerning the transport operators, we do not make guarantee for their profit. If they encounter any problems because of operating cost, and so as a result have to make application for fair rise, we will look at the justifications for the application and will also consider the affordability of the public. In the past 2 years, we have the subsidies for the 6 routes, but we also monitor closely their accounts so that they will not be lax in their operation. Question not answered. If they earn more than 5% in the 3 year, can money be taken out of the subsidized sum? What about the target return? Without that, it will be like giving them money. Don't repeat the question. Just give some time to the secretary. Don't repeat your question, because otherwise the secretary doesn't have time to give a reply. In Para 9, we undertook that in the next 3-year license period, there will be a mid-term review, as we have already done so for the previous license period. From the review, we understand whether the scheme is running smoothly, and we'll also understand that during the license period, what the operating profits are. If they enjoy substantial profits, we do not rule out any proportionate adjustment on the fare. That's not my question. Thank you, Chairman. I'm not asking about fare. We are asked to give them $190 million. Any target revenue or return, any target return? No. If that's the case, how come we're giving them hundreds of $millions? If they make a lot of profit, how come we are still subsidizing them? The members already raised that there may be a concern that more subsidies will be given to the operators. But you don't even have a target target return. So how come you are asking for this exact amount of $190 million? Ms. Priscilla Leung, to be objective, ferry service in Hong Kong is not exactly attractive commercially. I am speaking from experience. These 6 routes asking for subsidies, I support it. Now, for water transport in Hong Kong, I think we lack an overview. In the past few years, many ferry routes stopped servicing because they could no longer operate financially. And we asked the administration not just to look at the ferry services to outlying islands, but rather ferry services to other places as well. If some of them are suffering financially, whether the administration can provide any assistance. However, the administration simply sees the ferry services as a kind of mode of transport. This is not right and is not in line with the development of our harbour.
And even if you take high-tech development into account, many would suggest that we should rely on sea transport, and therefore you should be more flexible in terms of the routes. Should it just be the conventional approach so that the ferry services would be aligned in a straight line? And also for passengers who like to use ferries, it's not just because Victoria Harbour is very much part of our life. Please do not digress. You should not be referring to other services. Chairman, I think you're digressing. Well, you might think that I'm digressing, but I just hope that Professor Cheung can give us some insight. I think for the subsidy, it's not just about this. The Transport Panel has discussed that many times. It's not just about these ferry services. Well, for Hong Kong to North Point and also Hong Kong to Central, is it possible for us to consider it together with the Harbourfront Authority so that you can come up with a policy to ensure that ferry as a very important sea-based transport is not just about these 6 routes. When in fact other services are faced with similar problems. I think you should take it up at the Transport Panel because it's a policy issue. Yes, you have 1 minute, Professor. All right, on the issue of subsidy, what we are targeting those who are actually relying on the ferry services as the only mode of public transport. As for marine transport, including harbourfront development, and also having an aquatic park and so on. All right, that's not part of the proposal here. It's not part of the subsidy policy. Well, can you take it back to the policy? Take it back to the Bureau. For example, it's like the Environment Bureau. They said that they could not resolve some of the problems, but then at least they were willing to discuss it. All right, on the future development of sea transport, the THB is looking into it. Lee Cheuk-yen or Albert Ho. All right, if you look at the records, in fact, this policy was started in around in around 95, 96, about 18 years ago. Well, at the time, a group of us went to meet with government officials. We told them that, this is a necessary expenditure and therefore these passengers have no alternative, but then they could not afford it. Initially, we were told that the government would not be subsidizing them, but then how about power charges and other recurrent expenditure? You should subsidize them, and that was the beginning of this. And at the time, for any fare hike by ferry operators, they would have to go through this council, and they needed our approval. And at the time, it's hard to come up with some hard and fast rules or criteria as to what circumstances would be acceptable. Now the administration has taken back the power, so it's for the administration to approve them now. All right, 10 plus years ago you adopted that approach, but then is it still an appropriate way to do it? All right, for the vessels, they are no longer vessels that we talked about more than 10 years ago. Should we allow them to continue to repair and maintain these vessels? I think Michael Tian was right. So what's the policy? What's the plan? Do you have any regulatory plan or regime in place? All right, if you have a development plan and if I approve some of them, but then there might be certain expenditure items that I'll be reimbursing you, and therefore after I've given you the approval, then you can go ahead with your original plan, and then you will have this expected rate of return instead of just arbitrarily come up with a certain amount, and then you say that these are the reimbursable items. You would not be looking at the seaworthiness of the vessels. You're not going to look at other aspects of the operation in deciding on the level of subsidy. Well, we have done that before. I think Mr. Frankie Yik, he knows it very well because at the time he was responsible for Yau Ma Tei Ferry, and we had meetings with him. Actually, we also talk about some land development items. It's not just about the 4 piers. So I think the administration, I think you owe the entire community, in particular the outlying islands, this policy on transport subsidy. That's why many members have asked questions, including Michael Tian. I think he made a very good point. Does it mean that even if they make huge money, you're still going to subsidize them? And also, whether the vessels should be scrapped altogether, you dare not say it. And of course, we dare not reject your proposal because the situation will only get worse. So can you answer the questions that I just asked? Bureau Director. Yes, I understand the concerns raised by Mr. Ho and other members because if you have the subsidy policy in place, then would that be giving a policy green light so that they'll be able to seek reimbursement on any items that they want? That's not true. In fact, we'll be checking their accounts very carefully, but then we'll see if we can make improvements in some of these areas. But then in the long run, how are we able to ensure that the ferry services will be viable in the long run? Well, as I've said, well, in the future, we're going to look at the ferry policy. We'll be looking at it comprehensively, including how we can increase the non-fare box revenue for piers 4, 5, and 6 in Central. The development is one of the possible options. But of course, later on, we'll go back to the PWSC to get funding approval. But then all in all, I agree that we should have a comprehensive policy on that. Mr. Ho, I hope that, well, at least you have 3 more years to go. I hope that there can be a more comprehensive review on ferry services because we've talked about that for a long time. Frankie Yik. Chairman, first of all, a declaration of interest because I'm a shareholder or a director in Star Ferry. So I'm not a member of the Yau Ma Tei Ferry. So that's to clarify a point made by Mr. Ho just now. All right, the suggestion that the administration should be procuring the ferries while an operator should be asked to come in, I do not agree. I think the administration will not be able to do a better job than a private operator. And Michael Tian also asked if there is a target rate of return. If that's the case, then I'll be happy. And then I will not have a hard time when I ask for a fare increase because it's not a scientific figure, because there are also political considerations, whether politically it will be supported or not. And also you talk about the operating costs. It's been rising all the time. And also for ferry services, the machinery and everything else are imported. And therefore, if Hong Kong dollars continue to be pegged with the US dollar, then the cost will only go up. And if you look at the subsidy last time, all right, we talk about $114 million, and in the next 3 years, we're talking about $190 million. So the figure will only go up. And therefore, I share the views of other members. The administration must have a long-term policy. But then, regrettably, just a couple of weeks ago, when we talk about the superstructure at piers 4, 5, and 6, the funding proposal was rejected. I hope that the administration can submit the paper as soon as possible, because if you look at the Star Ferry experience, if you give us more space, then we can always make sure that it's self-sufficient. So that would absolutely help. But then as operators, we do not just rely on fare increase. There are other ways to go about it, and we've been working on that. And with the government's subsidy, the ferry operators said that they feel that in the future, even if there needs to be a fare increase, it should be rather moderate. But then I do not agree with other members, because we're talking about the use of public funds to subsidize the operations, and for residents living in outlying islands, well, if there is an appropriate adjustment, I think it's reasonable. Because if you just rely on public funds to offer long-term subsidy, there is also some room to be desired. Yes, in terms of the ferry services, yes, the operating cost has been going up, machinery, staff costs, and so on. And therefore, our subsidy policy is not to make sure that passengers do not have to take up any responsibility on the fare. But then we try to strike an appropriate balance so that if there is a need to increase fare, it should be affordable. Helena Wong, 2 minutes in the second round. Thank you, Chairman. I hope that the Bureau Director will come up with this review on Hong Kong's ferry policy as soon as possible. You should be looking into that together with the Development Bureau. And I hope that this ferry policy will not just be looking at the routes for outlying islands. You should also be looking at routes serving the Victoria Harbour, because some of the routes have been stopped. For example, Hong Kong to Wan Chai has been stopped. And there's only Hong Kong to Wan Chai. In fact, Tuen Mun, Kwun Tong, and many of the other routes have also been scrapped. I think we have such a nice and beautiful harbour. So how are we going to develop these in-harbour services and also services to the outlying islands? Of course, the most important thing is money. Please do not ignore the Victoria Harbour routes. Helena Wong, just now other colleagues have already raised the same point. I've also reminded them that today we are not on that subject. Yes, we're talking about ferry services. We are talking about the sustainability or otherwise of the service. We are not supposed to discuss the policy. Anyone else? If there are no further questions, then I'll put this to the vote. For those in favor of FCR, bracket 2013 to 14, close bracket 26, raise their hands. Those against, please raise their hands. I think for members participating in the vote, majority are in favor, and the item is approved. Item 3. FCR 2013-14-27. This item invites members to approve the creation of a new commitment of $400 million for funding the capital cost of retrofitting selective catalytic reduction devices on Euro 2 and 3 franchise buses in Hong Kong. On the 14th of June, the Environment Bureau consulted the Environmental Affairs panel of this Council, and to answer members' questions, we have the following officials here. I do not see the Undersecretary here, but we have Mr. Andrew Lai, Deputy Director of Environmental Protection, and Mr. Henry Chin, Senior Environmental Protection Officer from the EPD. And I'll invite the chairperson of the EA panel to brief us on the deliberation of the panel. Yes, thank you, Chairman. Well, at the meeting of the EA panel on the 14th of June, we discussed the issue, and members generally supported the administration's proposal in order to improve roadside air quality. But some members have indicated that if the SCR is not working properly, then that would also affect the operation of the buses, and therefore members asked the administration to put in place appropriate mechanism in order to monitor the operators to ensure that they would maintain and retrofit the devices properly on the buses. And some members have also indicated that they are concerned that with the SCR that would incur additional costs, and there might be some impact on bus fares. And some members are of the view that given the fact that the devices have already been funded fully by the administration, and the franchise bus operators are also making profits every year, and therefore on the principle of user pay, such costs should not be passed on to passengers. And a member was also against the funding proposal. He's of the view that to use $400 million on the retrofitting work is too costly, and there should be alternative ways to improve roadside air quality. That is that are more cost effective. Are there any questions from members? If not, then yes. Please press the button, Mr. Frankie Yik. Because I've already looked out several times, I couldn't see you. Mr. Yik? Yes, I just have a question for the Bureau. Under the plan, 1,400 franchise buses will be retrofitted with the device. But then if you look at the table, well, for Euro 2 and 3 buses and also Euro 1, if you add Euro 1 to that, then the figure will be a lot higher. Why is it that you're not retrofitting all buses with such devices? Is it that, after the end of phase 1, actually those that have not been retrofitted with the device will be phased out already? Undersecretary, have you heard the question? Because you've just come in. Yes, Mr. Lai. Well, on this occasion, we are targeting Euro 2 and 3 buses. There are two main principles. Well, after the retrofitting of the devices, the buses must have 2 more years to go in order to ensure that the devices can be put to full use. And also the second guiding principle is that with regard to the individual model of the buses, how many buses are there? For example, on this occasion, if there are less than 100, and also if the operator, after looking at the situation, if technically there is no space for the retrofitting of the SCR, then they will be taken out. And on those guiding principles, we think that there are about 1,400 franchise buses which can meet the criteria for the retrofitting of the devices.
Ms. Egg, follow up? Yes, well, in the paper, in BC roads, there will be low emission zones be introduced. So do you think 1,400 buses to be retrofitted with a device is sufficient? We do have plans that in 2015, in 3 BC road areas, there will be low emission areas. So only Euro 4 or more upgraded buses can be allowed to these zones. There are 1,400 Euro 2-3 buses retrofitted with the device, and they will be enhanced. And 3,000 new buses will be introduced according to the bus company. So in 2015, there will be enough buses that will meet the requirements of entering the low emission zone. Mr. KK Kwok, I support the scheme. I have some questions. Just now, officials from the EPD said that with new models being introduced, there will be new models of buses introduced. So this is our one-off allocation of fund. Is it the case? And we're just talking about KMB, Longwen, Citybus, New Welfare Bus to be covered under the scheme. What about Lantau buses? If not, why not? Next, about operating cost. After the SCR has been retrofitted, will there be a fall in operating cost? If so, when it comes to considering the fare, will this matter be considered so as to bring down the fare? Mr. Kwok is right in saying that this is just a one-off scheme. Franchise bus operators, in procuring new buses, they have to procure Euro 5 buses. And so these are greener buses compared to the existing ones. In subsidizing franchise buses, in retrofitting SCR, we cover all franchised bus operators. But how come we only list out 4 operators here without covering the Lantau bus operators is because the fleet of Lantau is smaller. That's why they cannot meet our requirements, so they're not covered by the scheme. Now for KMB, 1,100 buses and Longwind 9, New World 8, City Bus 18 and 250 for New World, so they meet our requirements. What about reducing the operating costs? Is there an implication? That actually is going to push up the operating cost, as you can see from para 16. After the SCR is retrofitted, the bus operator has to make adjustment to the urea, and there will be extra fuel to be consumed. But these costs amount to only 0.1% of the operator's annual operating costs. So the implication on fare rise is relatively small. For new Lantau bus operator, you say they're not covered because of the size of their fleet. Does it mean that they do not have any models that fit the requirements, or is it the case that they were not invited to join the scheme? For new Lantau bus operator, they only have over 100 buses at present. For bus models, they have different bus models. For Euro 2 and 3, they only have dozens of them. We have a requirement of having such buses of up to 100. So they do not meet this requirement. We did consider them, but it's just that their fleet size doesn't meet the requirement. This is not fair. For Longwind, they only have 9 buses. If the principle is to minimize emission, then you should not exclude anybody. Why don't you reconsidering opening the scheme to New Lantau? Because in doing so, the emission in Lantau will be lower. We want to turn Lantau into a low carbon and a green area. And in not covering them, these principles can't be met. Understand members' concern? There are 108 buses to New Lantau. Altogether for our Euro 2 and 3, 69 buses. And 5 models under these 2 kinds of buses. Now the scheme focuses on a fleet with more models, so we can enjoy higher cost effectiveness. Next, Mr. Leung Kai-cheng. Thank you, Chairman. Some technical questions. For this SCR, what's the effectiveness in terms of the emission, reduction to emission of RSP, NOx, and NO2? There's a usable life to the SCR. After the SCR has been retrofitted, it means the Euro 2, 3 buses will be equivalent to Euro 5 and 6 after the retrofitting. Buses emit NOx, NO2, and RSP. And at present, they've already retrofitted the diesel particulate filters. That is, the bus operators have already retrofitted the filters to the Euro 2, 3 buses for reduction of NO2, NOx. We need to retrofit SCR to reduce emission of NOx. For Euro 5, the SCR is already installed to reduce the emission of RSP and NOx. For the 1,400 buses, they should serve for 2 more years after the retrofitting of SRC. And we ask for a 4-year warranty by the suppliers of SCR. And so the bus can operate up to 5 to 6 years. For the remaining serviceable buses, there are only 130 plus that can serve for more than 6 years. What about the lowering of emission of NOx? How much reduction are we talking about? After retrofitting of SCR, we can have a reduction of 60% of NOx emission. Thank you. If there's no more question, I'll put the item to the vote. For those in favor of FCR 2013-14, 26, please raise the hands. 27. Those against, please raise their hands. I'm of the view that for members present, most of them support the item. Item passed. Next, FCR 2013-14, 30. Head 156, Education Bureau. Members are invited to approve a creation of a new commitment of $165.5 million for the provision of a one-off cash grant to kindergartens under pre-primary education voucher scheme. On the 10th of June this year, the Education Bureau consulted the Education Panel on this matter. With us today are Undersecretary for Education, Mr. Kevin Young, and Deputy Secretary for Education, Mrs. Betty Ip, and Principal Assistant Secretary for Education, Ms. Hira Chum. To discuss this matter, Mr. Lam Tai-Fai, Chairman of the panel, Education Panel, please give us a report on the discussion. The panel discussed the matter on the 10th of June this year. Each kindergarten under PEV scheme can get a one-off grant of up to $250,000. Some members are concerned whether the amount is sufficient to meet the cost for improving premises, facilities, and learning resources. Members are also concerned about whether the funding can alleviate pressure for tuition fee increase, and the amount should be used by the kindergartens in the next 3 years. Some members think that there should be more transparency and so as to monitor the effective use of public money. The administration said that the kindergartens concerned have to submit their audit account to the EDB so that the administration would know whether the money is well spent. Members also concerned about giving out development subsidy. The administration said that this is a separate matter than PEV. The 3-year period requirement is to ensure that the kindergartens can make flexible use of the amount. The panel support the funding application. Dr. Helena Wong, 5 minutes. Thank you, Chairman. We support the grant to the PEV scheme. Just now, Mr. Lam has told you about the concern at the panel. We're concerned whether the administration is stalling its feet. CY Leung said there will be 15-year free education, and the matter is being studied by certain councils, several councils. So how long will that take? This is a digression. Would you take up the question, Undersecretary? Our target is 2 years. Dr. Wong. The administration should know that for many kindergarten teachers, parents, principals of kindergartens, they want to see full subsidies for kindergarten education. Now, this scheme is only just a mild improvement. We're not against that. But you're not improving things like teacher's salary. This is also a digression. Any more questions? Mr. Ip Kin Yun. Chairman, Ms. Wang's questions are very important, but indeed they digress from our discussion today. I hope the administration will speed up the comprehensive review. Concerning the funding allocation, now understand the funding is for kindergartens for students up to 3 years old, but some daycare centers take in 1 to 2 year old children. They are not subsidized.
So apparently there is some coordination between the department and the SWD. All right, the SWD would be responsible for those from 0 to 2 years old, and then the EDB will take up the responsibility for those from 2 onwards. So, but then apparently there is a gap, and also for the whole day kindergarten schools, the problem will be more serious. Can you respond to that? So for whole day kindergartens, how come in terms of government policies and measures, they have not been given full assistance? Director or PAS? Yes, for whole day kindergartens, if they operate in the form of kindergartens, and if they take part in the voucher scheme, in fact, they will be covered by this scheme. And if they are kindergartens under the scheme, whether they are half-day or whole-day schools, they will still be getting the $150,000 or $250,000 as a one-off grant. No further questions. Sorry, Mr. Ip Kin Yun. Kenneth Leung is not here. My question is, well, for these whole-day kindergartens, many of them also run childcare centers, taking in some 2-year-old kids. So for such expenditure is still there. But then the scheme will not cover that. I think they've already answered the question. So what's your question? Are you saying that for those who are not running kindergartens, but then they're running childcare centers for 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds? Well, for kindergartens running also childcare centers, all right, at the kindergarten portion, I agree that part will get the subsidy. But then, if they are not covered by the education voucher scheme, then of course they will not be eligible. They can still have kindergartens under the voucher scheme. All right, Deputy Secretary. All right, we only cover kindergartens for those over 3 years old. But then, if the kindergarten itself is working under the voucher scheme, but then the kindergarten might also be running a childcare service for those under 3. All right, if you're talking about the same venue. All right, they have they are under the voucher scheme, but then they also have those under 3 years old. In fact, indirectly, those under 3 years old would also benefit, because if the facilities of the entire kindergarten can improve, then all kids will benefit. Mr. Ip, obviously, for this grant, it has to do with the number of people. And if the number is larger, and if they are not able to get a corresponding increase in the grant, then relatively speaking, the childcare center is not going to benefit. So my question is, how come the SWD and the Education Bureau, when you try to coordinate and cooperate, why can't you do a better job so that the subsidy can make sure that all these whole-day kindergartens can benefit? Chairman, it's not a question of coordination. The purpose of the scheme is to help kindergartens under the education voucher scheme to improve their quality. But then Mr. Ip is talking about how we can help those that are not kindergartens under the voucher scheme, they are running childcare centers, and how they can get the subsidy and how they can do a better job. This is not what we are talking about here. I think there is a gap here, because for the 2-year-old and 3-year-old, you're actually segregating them, and for those over 3 years, all right, the Education Bureau will take care of them by offering this grant and voucher. But then for those below that, they would not be taken care of under the voucher scheme. This is another policy. You're trying to make sure that for those 2-year-olds, they would also be getting the subsidy. I think you will have to take it up at another panel. That's another subject. This is a one-off grant. This is a one-off financial support for improving the school premises of these voucher scheme kindergartens. All right, you've already used up your time. Priscilla Leung, I think in the long run, we have to have 15-year free education, and of course we will have to take it up at the education panel. But then for the one-off grant for pre-primary education, I'm concerned about one thing. Well, yesterday at the Kowloon City District Council, we also had a major discussion on this. That is about these kindergartens, whether you call them kindergartens or voucher scheme institutions. All right, in terms of miscellaneous charges, we have received many complaints that they are overcharging. Priscilla Leung, sorry, my apology, because we are talking about the one-off grant, and it's about kindergartens and childcare centers, whether or not they are overcharging or what. It has nothing to do with that at all. Sorry, that would also affect whether or not I'm going to vote in favor of that. You can vote against it, but then it's about the policy. When you ask about miscellaneous charges, I think you're digressing. But then we also have thousands of amendments. They are filibustering, and you still allow them. But Priscilla Leung, I think what you're asking has nothing to do with this item. This will affect my voting. You will have to allow me to finish. I'm not going to allow you to talk about miscellaneous charges. You will have to ask questions on this item. You can decide not to support it. Well, that would be on the basis of whether or not the Education Bureau has done its job in supervising how the money is used. If I support it, then I'll have to make sure that the money is used in the right place. So could it be that when they charge miscellaneous charges, they are not using that on education? And how are they going to spend the money? Because sometimes the facilities would be handed over to the affiliated companies. Is there any declaration of interest mechanism? And how do we monitor the use of it? I think that's very important. Deputy Secretary. Chairman, we have a very stringent monitoring mechanism. We will require them to come up with a breakdown so that every dollar that is spent will have to be accounted for, and there will also be guidelines for procurement and also for hiring of staff and so on. So we'll be monitoring the use of it very stringently. Chairman, he has not answered the question. Yes, we know that sometimes they would use their own affiliated companies in providing certain facilities and services. So would there be declaration of interest mechanism? Because after we have given them the subsidy, we do have the power to, or we do have the right to monitor how it's used. Well, for procurement matters, if they are procuring data with affiliated companies, then they will have to declare. So we'll be able to check. All right, the declaration is clear. Is that right? I'd like to know if any other member would like to ask questions, and they have not raised their hands, because we have to finish by 5:45, and all of a sudden we have 3 more members who have indicated that they'd like to speak, and one would also be asking in the second round. Are there anybody who has not asked questions in the first round? Yes, Frankie Yik. Well, Chairman, my question is similar to that raised by Priscilla Leung. I'm also interested in a monitoring mechanism. Just now, the Undersecretary said that in terms of the procurement of services, all right, and also in terms of the hiring of staff, there would be established procedures. But then you're giving this grant for use in the next 3 years. So will there be any prescribed criteria in how the funds can be used? Because you also said that the objective is to enhance the quality of education. With FC's approval, in August we will be issuing a detailed set of guidelines telling them how the money should be used and how that will be monitored. They will have to have detailed records. So the guideline will be very detailed. Mr. Frankie Yik, no further follow-up. Tam Yu Chong, Chairman. Well, the DAB supports this, and I understand that the administration is looking into the 15-year free education, including pre-primary education. Well, we understand that these kindergartens, all right, there are different types of kindergartens. That's why there are many problems that will not be easy to resolve. And if we have interim measures to help them, we support that. And if there is anything that we can do to help them, then I welcome the administration's submission of further proposals. Nothing to answer. Mr. Young, Mr. Lam Tai Fai, well, some members have spoken on this, and I think they have digressed, and therefore, as the chairman of the education panel, I'd just like to supplement on what I just reported on our deliberation with regard to free kindergarten education. In April, the administration already set up a committee, and the education panel on the 9th of July in the morning, we are going to discuss this item, and of course, I hope that all members, whether they are panel members or not, can take part enthusiastically to express their views. Well, for the one-off grant, in fact, in chairing the education panel meeting, I've already said it many times. That is, well, it has nothing to do with the free kindergarten education, and the purpose of this fund is to improve the premises and also to improve learning resources for the kindergarten teachers and so on. I hope that members will have a clear idea as to the purpose of the funding. 2 minutes in the second round. Ip Kin Yun. Chairman, I'd like to say that, well, last time at the education panel meeting, actually I also said that I would support this item. But then at the same time, while I agree that we should support it, I find it regrettable to note that for the kindergarten or the childcare center part, it has been taken out. Because as far as the government's policy is concerned, early childhood education has not become part of the government's policy, and that's why for a long while, for those running whole-day kindergartens, they have not been properly taken care of. This is just one of the examples. And once again, this shows that it's an area that we have to work on. I hope that the administration can work with the SWD so that there can be a more consistent and effective government policy so that pre-primary education can be viewed in its totality so that funding and support can be provided. It's not a question. I'm just expressing my view. Priscilla Leung. Yes, I agree that 15-year free education should be discussed at the education panel. But then on this funding, I also talk about the declaration mechanism. Other than declaration of interest, I also hope that you can look into this. That is, we have seen some figures. It says that the price is not right. They might have introduced some services. And also they might have installed some facilities that are not up to what the market is expecting. You will have to have your own criteria. You will have to have a stringent control so that for the money that has been given to them, you will have to make sure that it's used indeed on education. Undersecretary. Chairman, as I just said, we would require them to have very stringent reporting, tendering, and everything. And when we look at the accounts, if there are any items that are not reasonable, then we will, of course, double check it. Yes? Any further questions? If not, then I'll put this item to the vote. For those in favor of this item, FCR 2013-14-30, please raise your hands. Those against, please raise their hands. I think for those taking part in the vote, a majority of them are in favor. The item is approved. We have already completed all the agenda items, and the next meeting will be held on the 13th of July this year. Thank you. Sorry, 12th of July, Friday. Thank you.